The ledger book hit the kitchen table with a crack like a gunshot, and Henrietta Conley's hands went still against her apron. "Every cent," Aaron Graves said, his voice low and controlled in a way that made it more frightening than if he had shouted. "Every single cent I paid you this past month was $12 more than we agreed." Henrietta did not look away from him. She had learned long ago that looking away was the same as admitting guilt, and she was not guilty. Not in the way he meant. "I did not ask you to pay me more than we agreed," she said. "No," he said, his jaw tight, his dark eyes fixed on her with something unreadable behind them. "You didn't ask for any of it. That's the problem." She stared at him across the scrubbed pine table, the morning light cutting through the single kitchen window and laying itself across the ledger in a long gold bar. Outside, she could hear the ranch hands beginning their day, the sound of horses in the yard, the clang of iron at the forge. The ordinary sounds of the Graves spread, which had become, without her ever intending it, the only place she had begun to feel safe in 3 years. "You paid me a fair wage," she said carefully. "I worked for every dollar. I paid you a fair wage, and then I paid the doctor's bill for your daughter's croup without telling you, and I paid the price of the new boots I left outside your door in November, and I paid for the fabric Mrs. Delacroix delivered to the bunkhouse without your name on the order slip." He paused. "I thought I was being careful. I thought you'd never know." The breath left her body in a slow, controlled exhale. She had known. She had known for weeks and said nothing because to say something would have meant acknowledging that Aaron Graves had been looking after her in 100 quiet ways ever since the day she had walked through his front gate with her 4-year-old daughter on her hip and asked him for work. Not charity. Work. She had been very specific about that, and he had given her work. He had also given her everything else, and he had done it in such a way that she was never meant to find out. "You had no right," she said, and her voice came out wrong, softer than she intended, closer to broken than she could afford. "I know it," he said, and looked at her with those dark, quiet eyes and did not apologize. That was the moment everything changed. That was the moment when the careful architecture of the arrangement between them, the clean transaction of work given and wages paid, began to fall apart in a way that neither of them could stop. To understand how they had arrived at this kitchen, at this table, at this particular morning of reckoning, you would need to go back 8 months. You would need to go back to April of 1882 in the dust-bitten town of Cassidy Creek, Texas, where the drought had been eating at the land for 2 years running, and where Henrietta Conley had arrived on the southbound stage with nothing to her name but a carpetbag, a child, and a ferocious determination to survive. Cassidy Creek sat at the edge of the Edwards Plateau, a stubborn little cluster of buildings that clung to the dry red earth the way lichen clings to rock. There was a general store run by a man named Fowler who weighed everything twice and trusted nobody, a saloon called the Blue Meridian that did a brisk trade by Thursday of every week, a Baptist church whose white paint was flaking badly, a small post office, and a land office that had been closed for 6 months on account of its proprietor having lost both his hands to a thrashing machine in the autumn. The nearest town of any size was Abilene, which was 60 miles north and might as well have been the moon. Henrietta had not planned to stop in Cassidy Creek. She had been heading to San Antonio, where she had the name of a boarding house and the vague hope of finding work as a seamstress. But the stage had thrown a wheel on the descent from the plateau, and in the resulting chaos of passengers and luggage and a very unhappy team of horses, her carpetbag had been split open on a rock, and she had spent 40 minutes on her hands and knees in the red dirt gathering back her belongings. And by the time the wheel had been repaired and everyone had climbed back aboard, she had counted the money in her purse 3 times and accepted the fact that San Antonio was no longer possible. She had exactly $4.30. Her daughter Lily was running a fever that worried her deeply, and the next stage south would not come through for 4 days. She had climbed down from the stage in Cassidy Creek with Lily on her hip and her repaired carpetbag in her hand, and she had stood in the main street in the April heat and done the only thing she could do. She had looked for work. The general store did not need anyone. The saloon had suggested something she had declined without changing her expression. The church had offered prayer and $3 from the benevolent fund, and she had taken the prayer and left the money because $3 of charity felt like a door closing, like the beginning of a particular kind of story she refused to be in. The woman at the boarding house on 2nd Street had taken one look at Lily's flushed face and shaken her head slowly, meaning no, not until the child was well, because she could not risk the other guests. It was old Sam Pickett at the feed store who had told her about Aaron Graves. "He's the biggest rancher in the county," Sam said, pouring grain into a measure with the slow deliberation of a man who had stopped hurrying decades ago. "Lost his housekeeper in February when she went back east to nurse her sister. He's got the ranch house and a good spread, 1,200 acres at least, and he's been making a hash of the cooking and cleaning ever since. Man can run cattle in his sleep, but he cannot make a pot of cornbread to save his soul." "Is he a decent man?" Henrietta had asked, because that was the question that mattered. Sam had considered this for a moment with the seriousness it deserved. "He's a fair man," he said at last. "Which is better than decent in my experience. Decent is how men describe themselves. Fair is what their workers call them." She had found out where the Graves spread was located, which was 4 miles northeast of town along the Creek Road. She had asked Mrs. Dunbar at the dressmaker's shop to look after Lily for an hour, and Mrs. Dunbar, who was a soft-hearted woman beneath a stiff exterior, had agreed and given the child a piece of hard candy and installed her on a chair behind the cutting table. And then Henrietta had walked the 4 miles in the April heat because she could not afford to hire the livery stable's rig. She had arrived at the Graves ranch gate in the late afternoon with her boots white with dust and her back straight as a fence rail, and she had introduced herself to the first person she saw, who happened to be a ranch hand named Cole, who was mending a section of fence near the gate. "I'm looking for Mr. Graves," she had said. "I understand he may be in need of a housekeeper." Cole had looked at her with a complicated expression and said, "Yes, ma'am, I reckon he is," and gone to fetch his employer. Aaron Graves had come out of the barn wearing his work clothes, which were not his Sunday best by a considerable distance. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered and spare, with dark eyes and a face that weather had worked on honestly, the kind of face that showed what a man had done more than what he had felt. He had looked at Henrietta the way a practical man looks at a situation that requires practical analysis, taking in the dust on her boots and the quality of her posture and the directness of her gaze, and he had said, "What are your terms?" Which was exactly the right question to ask. She had told him. She wanted $12 a month, a room in the main house, and 1 day off per week, which would be Sunday. She would cook 3 meals daily, maintain the house, do laundry on Tuesdays and Fridays, and she needed to know whether he had any objections to her daughter living on the property. He had been quiet for a moment. "How old is the child?" 4 years. "Does she have her health?" "She has a fever today. I believe it's croup. She'll be well in a week." She had said it flatly, without asking for sympathy, because she was not asking for sympathy. Something in his face had shifted almost imperceptibly. Not pity, something else. "I can offer $12 a month in the room," he said. "The child is welcome. I'll have Cole bring in a second bed for the room." "That's acceptable," she had said. "I can start Monday." "Where are you staying until Monday?" She had not answered immediately, and that slight pause had told him more than any words would have. "I'll make an arrangement," she said. "There's a room ready now," he said. "Start when you're ready." She had looked at him for a long moment, deciding whether there was a trap in it, reading the straight, calm line of him with the thoroughness of a woman who had learned to read men accurately as a matter of survival. There had been no trap. There had been, she would later understand, a kind of quiet decency that was so unassuming it was almost impossible to recognize at first. "I'll need to collect my daughter from town," she had said. "Cole will take you in the wagon." And that had been the beginning. The Graves ranch house was a well-built structure of whitewashed stone and cedar, 2 stories, with a deep porch running the length of the front and a kitchen large enough to work in comfortably. Aaron Graves had built it himself 12 years ago when he had staked his claim on the creek land and started running cattle, and he had built it in a way that suggested he had intended to fill it with a family. There was a parlor with a good stone fireplace and a bookcase with perhaps 40 volumes. There was a dining room that could seat 10. There were 4 bedrooms upstairs, only one of which was occupied. The house had the particular forlorn quality of a space built for more life than it currently contained. Henrietta had noted all of this without commenting on it, because commenting on the private sadness of a man's home was not part of her agreement with him. She had settled into the work with the efficiency of a woman who had been doing difficult things alone for a long time. The kitchen, which had been in a state of polite disorder, she reorganized within 2 days according to her own system. She made bread on Monday and Thursday. She kept the stove fed and the fire even and the meals regular. She scrubbed the kitchen floor on her hands and knees and discovered that the whitewash on the kitchen walls needed refreshing and informed Aaron of this fact as a practical matter, and he had sent for lime, and she had done it herself on a Tuesday afternoon when the laundry was drying on the line. Aaron Graves had watched all of this from a careful distance. He ate her meals and paid her wages and was courteous in the way that a man who has learned to be careful around women he respects is courteous, which is to say quietly and without flourish. He said good morning when he came in for breakfast and thank you when he left the table. He did not ask her questions about where she had come from or where she was going. He did not comment on the fact that there was no husband or inquire after one, or make any suggestion whatsoever that her situation was anything other than straightforward. Lily recovered from her croup in 9 days, which was 2 days longer than Henrietta had estimated. During those 9 days, she had managed the house and the cooking and her daughter's illness with the kind of focused ferocity that left no room for anything to go wrong. She had been up at 4 in the morning boiling water for steam, and she had been at the stove by 5, and she had not, in those 9 days, allowed herself a single moment of self-pity. On the 10th day, when Lily had woken bright-eyed and hungry and scrambled down from the bed asking for biscuits, Henrietta had stood at the stove for a full minute with her back to the room before she was able to compose herself. She had not cried. She had made the biscuits. Aaron had come in for breakfast that morning and found Lily sitting at the kitchen table eating biscuits with molasses, chattering with the unrestrained enthusiasm of a child whose fever has broken, and something in his face had softened in a way that Henrietta had noticed and filed away in the careful catalog she was building of Aaron Graves. "She's better," he said. "Yes," Henrietta said. "She'll need to stay indoors another day or 2, but she's past the worst." He had looked at Lily for a moment with an expression that was almost tender, and then caught himself and looked at Henrietta instead. "Good," he said, and sat down to his breakfast. Lily, who had no reserve of caution where adults were concerned, and apparently no sense of the careful distance that existed between her mother and the owner of this house, said, "Are you Mr. Graves?" "I am," he said. "Mama says you're a fair man," Lily said. "What does fair mean?" There had been a beat of silence, and then Aaron Graves had looked at Henrietta with a flicker of something that might have been amusement, and Henrietta had felt heat rise to her face that had nothing to do with the stove. "It means I try to do right by people," Aaron said to Lily gravely. "Papa wasn't a fair man," Lily said, in the conversational way that children announce the contents of their world without understanding the weight of what they're carrying. "Mama says he had dark secrets." "Lily," Henrietta said, and the word was quiet, but it landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. Lily looked at her mother, sensed the boundary, and applied herself to her biscuits. Aaron did not press, did not ask. He finished his breakfast and thanked her and went out to the horses, and Henrietta stood at the sink washing dishes and understood that she had just revealed more to this man in 30 seconds than she had intended to reveal in the whole of her arrangement with him. Daniel Conley had been dead for 2 years by the time Henrietta arrived at the Graves ranch. Dead by his own recklessness, which was the most honest way to describe it, though the coroner in Waco had written misadventure in his ledger, because the Conleys were not entirely without standing in Waco society, and misadventure was a gentler word than the truth warranted. The truth was that Daniel Conley had gambled away their house and their savings and a good portion of Henrietta's dignity, and when he had been caught cheating at cards in the wrong company had decided that the debt would be paid in a currency other than money. She had not seen it happen. She had been at home with Lily, who had been 2 years old and asleep, and she had heard the knock at the door at 10:30 at night, and opened it to find Daniel's colleague Mr. Pemberton on her threshold with his hat in his hand and a carefully arranged expression of sorrow on his face. And she had known before he opened his mouth that the structure of her life had just come down. The months that followed had been a kind of education she would not have chosen. She had learned the specific texture of poverty that comes not from birth but from fall, which is sharper and more humiliating than any other kind, because it arrives with a before and an after, and everyone around you knows the before. She had learned that a widow with a small child and no money is a particular kind of invisible to the world, present enough to be pitied and insufficient to be helped in any way that mattered. She had learned that charity, offered from positions of comfort to people in distress, has a particular quality of condescension that poisons it even when the giver means well. She had spent 18 months in Waco in various states of managed survival, doing laundry for other families, taking in mending, teaching the piano to children whose families could afford lessons, stretching every dollar until it was thin as paper. And when the opportunity had finally presented itself to make a change, she had packed what she owned and bought a stage ticket to San Antonio and headed south toward whatever came next. What came next was Cassidy Creek and Aaron Graves, and a room in a stone house with a good stove, and $12 a month in work that was honest and dignified and hers. She settled into the rhythms of the ranch with a kind of relief she did not allow herself to examine too closely. The work was physically demanding in a way she found clarifying rather than exhausting. The mornings were early and the days were long, and there was always more to do. But it was the kind of more to do that she could see and measure and accomplish, which was entirely different from the formless anxiety of the months in Waco, where she was never quite sure if she had done enough. Lily thrived in the way that children thrive when they are fed regularly and allowed to run outdoors. She became a familiar figure on the ranch, a small, bright-haired presence who could most often be found following Cole at a respectful distance while he worked, asking him questions about horses with a concentration that bordered on professional. Cole, who was a patient man in his mid-30s with a wife in town and 3 children of his own, accepted this arrangement with good humor. Aaron Graves did not interfere with any of it. He ran his ranch with the focused competence of a man who had built something from nothing and knew exactly what it required. He was up before dawn and often still working after dark, and he was not the kind of man who explains himself or announces his intentions or talks about his feelings, which in Henrietta's experience was either very good or very bad depending entirely on the man. In Aaron's case, it appeared to be very good. His silence was not the silence of concealment or cruelty. It was the silence of a man who had decided that actions were more reliable than words, and who acted accordingly. She noticed the small things first, because she was a woman who paid attention to small things. The firewood outside the kitchen door was always freshly split and stacked before she came downstairs in the morning, which was not something she had asked for and not something she had been promised. She had assumed, initially, that one of the ranch hands was responsible. Then one morning in early June she had come down at 4:30 and heard the sound of an axe in the gray pre-dawn dark, and when she had looked out the kitchen window she had seen Aaron Graves in the yard, his shirt damp in the cool morning air, working through a stack of wood with the rhythmic efficiency of long practice. She had stepped back from the window quickly, before he could look up and see her watching. She had said nothing about it. He had said nothing about it. In July, Lily had admired a small carved horse in the window of Fowler's General Store with the undisguised longing of a 4-year-old, and Henrietta had moved her gently past it because she could not justify the 30-cent expense. 2 days later, she had found a carved horse on the kitchen table. It was better made than the one in Fowler's window. When she asked Cole about it, he shrugged in a way that meant he knew but wasn't telling. She had set the horse on the windowsill in Lily's room and said nothing. In August, she had cut her hand on a broken jar and wrapped it herself with a strip of clean cotton and said nothing about it. And the next week, when she was taking stock of the kitchen, she found a small tin of the carbolic salve that the druggist in town kept, sitting in the cupboard between the salt and the baking powder. She had never mentioned the cut to Aaron, and she had not been to town that week. The only explanation was that he had noticed the bandage and sent for the salve without saying so. By September, she understood that Aaron Graves was looking after her in a sustained and systematic way that he apparently had no intention of ever discussing, and this fact had lodged itself in her chest like an ember, warm and slightly alarming, neither comfortable nor painful but impossible to ignore. She had also, by September, begun to understand something about Aaron Graves himself. His silences were not empty. He listened with a quality of attention that was unusual in her experience, the kind of attention that made you feel that what you were saying was being taken seriously, not just heard. He had opinions about things, real considered opinions, and when he offered them, which was not often, they were worth hearing. He read the books on the parlor shelves and occasionally left one on the kitchen table with no comment, which she understood to be an offering, and she read them and occasionally left them back with a bookmark somewhere in the middle to indicate she had not finished, and he would sometimes say in the evening, over the remains of supper, "What do you make of it so far?" And they would talk about the book, and those conversations were some of the most satisfying she had had in years. He was also, she noticed, a man carrying something. She could not have named it precisely. It was in the way he sometimes stood at the edge of the south pasture in the evenings looking at nothing, or the way his jaw tightened when certain topics came up, or the way the 4 empty bedrooms upstairs seemed to mean something to him that he had not put into words and perhaps never would. She knew better than to ask. She had her own things she was carrying, and the agreement between them, the unspoken agreement that had grown up around the practical arrangement of work and wages, included a mutual respect for closed doors. In October, 2 things happened that began, quietly and with no ceremony, to shift the ground between them. The first was a storm. It came in from the northwest on a Tuesday night in the second week of October, the kind of storm the old-timers called a blue norther, because the sky went the color of a bruise before the wind arrived. It hit the ranch in the small hours of Wednesday morning with a ferocity that woke everyone. Henrietta had Lily in her arms before she was fully awake, and she was in the kitchen within minutes stoking the stove because it was the warmest room in the house, and the temperature was dropping at a pace that felt personal, like a threat. Aaron came downstairs 5 minutes later, fully dressed, because a rancher's first thought in a storm is his animals. He had taken one look at Henrietta at the stove with Lily wrapped in a quilt in the chair beside her and said, "Keep the stove hot," and gone out into the screaming dark. He had been out there for 4 hours. She had heard him and the hands moving in the yard, the shouting of voices against the wind, the frightened sounds of horses. She had kept the stove hot and made coffee and kept Lily calm and waited. When he came back in at 6 in the morning, the storm was still running but the worst had passed, and he was soaked through, and so cold his hands were not working properly. She had made him sit at the table and wrapped a blanket around him and put coffee in front of him and not said a single unnecessary word, and he had sat there for a few minutes warming his hands around the mug and then looked up at her and said, with a directness that surprised her, "Thank you, Henrietta." He had used her first name. It was the first time he had done so. She had been Miss Conley for 6 months. She had said, "Of course," and turned back to the stove, and the warmth she felt had nothing to do with the fire. The second thing that happened in October was that she found the letter. She had not been snooping. She had been cleaning the parlor, which she did on alternating Wednesdays, and she had been wiping down the mantelpiece when a letter had slipped from behind the clock and fallen to the floor. She had picked it up intending to replace it, and had not been able to stop her eyes from moving across the first 3 lines before she caught herself. What she read in those 3 lines was enough. The letter was from someone in Austin, a woman named Clara Whitmore, and it was 3 years old, and in 3 lines it managed to convey both the end of an engagement and the particular cruelty of an ending that had been caused not by the failure of feeling, but by the intrusion of practical considerations, meaning money. Aaron had lost a substantial portion of his herd in the winter of 1879 to a combination of blizzard and disease. The losses had been ruinous. Clara Whitmore had determined that she could not, in good conscience, enter into the arrangement they had discussed. The letter was carefully folded and worn along the creases in a way that suggested it had been read many times. It had been kept behind the parlor clock for 3 years. Henrietta had replaced it precisely where it had been and finished cleaning the mantelpiece with great care, and not thought about it again for several days. When she finally allowed herself to think about it, she did so with the controlled, analytical approach she applied to all difficult things. She thought about what it meant that a man who had been betrayed in a particularly cold-blooded way had nevertheless built a home with 4 bedrooms and a dining room that could seat 10. She thought about what it meant that he had never remarried, never, as far as she could tell, even tried. She thought about what it meant that he had taken in a widowed woman and her small daughter with an even-handedness that had nothing performative in it, no display of magnanimity, just a simple practical arrangement that he had then quietly supplemented in a dozen ways he never intended her to discover. She thought about Aaron Graves for longer than she intended to that evening, sitting at the kitchen table after Lily was in bed, and when she caught herself doing it, she stood up and put the thought away firmly and went to check the stove. November arrived with a cold that settled into the bones of the land and stayed there. Henrietta was careful with the firewood and careful with the food stores and careful, as always, with her money. She had been putting aside $2 of every $12 wage since she arrived, a small emergency reserve that she kept in an envelope in the lining of her carpetbag. By November she had $14 saved, which was not enough to be safe but was enough to be less frightened than she had been in April. She had not thought about leaving. She had not yet allowed herself to examine why. The boots had appeared on a Thursday morning in the second week of November, set outside the door of her room. They were good boots, women's boots, with proper soles, the kind of thing that would last several winters. Her own boots had developed a crack in the left sole in September, which she had been managing with a piece of oilskin folded inside, and she had been telling herself for 2 months that she would get them repaired when she could justify the expense. She had stood at the door of her room for a full minute looking at those boots before she picked them up. She carried them downstairs and set them on the kitchen table and looked at them for another minute. Then she made breakfast as she did every morning, and when Aaron came in she put his plate in front of him and said, without preamble, "I found boots outside my door." He looked at his plate. Cole's wife sent them. She said they were her sister's, said her sister bought 2 pairs last spring and these ones didn't fit. It was such a complete and specific lie that she almost smiled. She understood, with perfect clarity, that he had bought the boots and constructed a story around them, and that the story was his way of giving her something without making her feel the weight of the giving. She understood the impulse. She even appreciated it in a complicated way that made her feel things she was not prepared to examine. "Tell Mrs. Cole thank you," she said. "I'll pass it along," he said, and ate his breakfast. She wore the boots. They fit perfectly because he had clearly measured her old ones, and that small detail, the evidence of that much deliberate attention, had sat with her for days afterward like something she could not quite put down. The fabric had come in December. A bolt of good blue wool delivered by Mrs. Delacroix, who ran a kind of informal dressmaking business from her house on the Creek Road. No order slip, no name, Mrs. Delacroix had been carefully, professionally vague about who had placed the order, saying only that someone had wanted it delivered to the Graves ranch. Henrietta had accepted it because turning it away would have required acknowledging something she was not yet ready to acknowledge, and also because it was good fabric and she needed to make Lily a proper winter coat. She had made the coat and had enough fabric left for a dress for herself, the first new dress she had owned in 3 years, and she had made it and worn it on Christmas morning, which was also when Aaron's ranch hands brought their families to the house for the Christmas meal she had been planning for 2 weeks. And Aaron had looked at her in the blue dress with an expression she had not seen on his face before, and then looked away quickly, and said something to Cole about the fence in the east pasture that she was fairly certain made no actual sense. Christmas Day had been the best day she had experienced in 3 years. The house had been full in the way it was built to be full, with children running and the ranch hands at ease with their families, and the smell of roasted meat and fresh bread and wood smoke all mixed together. And Lily had been in a state of transparent joy. And at some point in the evening when things had gotten loud and cheerful, Aaron had come to stand beside Henrietta where she was watching from the kitchen doorway, and they had stood together in companionable quiet for a long moment, not touching, not saying anything. And she had been more aware of his presence beside her than she had been aware of anything in a very long time. He had said, quietly, "You did a good thing today." And she had said, equally quietly, "You built a house that wanted this." He had been still for a moment after that, and then he had excused himself and gone back to his guests, and she had watched him go and understood that something had shifted between them that she could not shift back. The doctor's bill she had discovered in January. Lily had had a bad week in late November, the croup returning more severely than the first time, and Henrietta had been sufficiently frightened to send for the doctor from town. Dr. Hale had come out and examined Lily and prescribed an inhalant treatment and a rest from cold air, and at the end of the visit had said his fee was $3. Henrietta had paid it from her emergency envelope and thought no more about it until she had checked her envelope in January and found it contained $4 more than it should have. She had gone back through her wages carefully. She accounted for every dollar. The extra $4 should not have been there. She had thought about it for 3 days. Then she had asked Cole, carefully and without accusation, whether Mr. Graves had said anything to him about the doctor's fee. Cole had gone a particular shade of neutral that told her everything. "I don't know anything about any doctor's fee," he had said, which was true and also completely beside the point. It was the ledger book that had finally made it impossible to ignore. She had found it on Aaron's desk in the small office off the parlor when she had gone in to clean, and she had not opened it, but the desk had been organized in a particular way and the ledger had been open, and her name had been at the top of a column of figures that, once she had seen them, she could not unsee. The boots, the fabric, the doctor's fee, the extra wood, the carved horse which she now understood had not been free. All of it was there, accounted for with the careful precision of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and had decided to do it quietly. She had closed the ledger. She had finished cleaning the office. She had gone back to the kitchen and made supper and fed Lily and put her to bed and sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a long time before she knew what she was going to do. She was going to confront him about it. Because she could not live inside a secret of this size without it changing the terms of everything between them, and she needed to know what he thought he was doing and why, and she needed him to stop, and she also, in a part of herself she was not quite honest with yet, needed to see his face when she said it. She had gotten up the next morning and made breakfast and waited for him to come in from the barn, and when he sat down, she had set the ledger on the table between them, which was where we began. He had said, "I know it," and not apologized, and she stood there looking at him across the kitchen table in the morning light, and understood that this was the moment when she had to decide who she was going to be. She could thank him with formality and distance, and continue the arrangement as it was, and both of them would know what had happened, and neither of them would say so. She could ask him to stop, and he would stop, and the careful warmth that had been building between them would be replaced with a different kind of careful distance, or she could tell the truth. She sat down at the table, which was not what she had planned to do. She had planned to stand because standing felt more in control, but her legs seemed to have decided differently, and so she sat. "Why?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the horses were moving in the yard, and Cole was shouting something at someone. All the ordinary music of the ranch going on without reference to the extraordinary quiet in this kitchen. "Because you came here asking for work," he said, "and you worked, and I saw what the work cost you, and I wanted to make it less without making it mean less." She absorbed that for a moment. "You didn't want me to feel like a charity case. I didn't want you to feel like anything except someone doing her job and doing it well, which you were. So you gave me charity and hid it as something else. I gave you what I could see you needed without making you feel the weight of it," he said. "Whether that's charity depends on the motive, I suppose." "And what was the motive?" she asked. The question landed between them with a weight that was entirely different from the question of boots and doctor's fees and ledger books. Aaron Graves looked at Henrietta Conley across the kitchen table, and for the first time since she had met him, he did not look like a man holding something back. He looked like a man deciding to stop holding it. "I think you know what the motive was," he said quietly. She did know. She had known for months. She had been not knowing it very deliberately for months, filing it in the part of her mind that she kept closed, because knowing it would have required her to act on it, and she had not been ready to act on it. She thought of Daniel Conley and his dark secrets, and the way that marriage had felt in its last year, like living inside something that was collapsing around her. She thought of the particular freedom of the past 8 months, the clean transaction of work and wages, the way she had built something of her own here, carefully, with her own hands. She thought of the letter behind the parlor clock and Clara Whitmore, and the way Aaron had folded that particular wound inside himself for 3 years without letting it make him small or mean. "I'm not looking for," she began. "I know you're not," he said. "I'm not asking for anything. I haven't asked you for anything. I want to be clear about that." "But," she said. "But I thought you should know," he said, "why the boots were there, and the fabric, and the rest of it. It wasn't because I thought you were helpless. It was because—" He stopped, and she could see him choosing words carefully, the way a man who means what he says chooses words when what he means matters. "It was because you were sitting at this table at 4 in the morning when Lily was sick and your hands were shaking and you didn't ask anyone for anything, and I found that harder to watch than I expected." The kitchen was very quiet. She could hear the fire in the stove. "That was November," she said. "The first time Lily was sick." "Yes." "You've been since November." "Yes." 8 months of small kindnesses, carefully hidden. 8 months of Aaron Graves paying attention to her in 100 quiet ways while she paid attention to him in 100 quiet ways, and neither of them said anything, because neither of them was ready, and because the arrangement between them was clean and honest, and they both valued clean and honest things. "Aaron," she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name, and he heard it the way it was meant, and something in his face changed. "I know it's complicated," he said. "I know you came here needing work and not other things. I know you have Lily, and I know you didn't come here looking for anything beyond wages and a room. I'm not asking you to change what this is. I just couldn't keep up the pretense that it was simpler than it was." She looked at him for a long time. She looked at his hands on the table, working hands, honest hands. She looked at his face, which was showing her something real for the first time, not the careful neutral competence she had been looking at for 8 months, but the actual man beneath it, with his actual feelings showing. She said, "I think I should tell you something." He waited. "I have been aware of you," she said, "in ways that are not relevant to my position here for longer than I'm comfortable admitting. I have been very deliberate about keeping that in its proper place because I have Lily to consider and I have my own things that make this complicated and because I was afraid." She paused. "I am afraid of things going wrong. I have had experience with things going wrong." "I know you have," he said, and there was no performance in it, no falseness. Just acknowledgement. "I am not saying yes to anything," she said. "I'm saying that if you are telling me you have feelings in that direction, I am not indifferent to knowing it." He took a careful breath. "That's all I needed to know," he said. She nodded once sharply, as if they had reached a practical agreement. Then she stood up and went to the stove and poured coffee into both their cups and set his in front of him and sat back down. "The extra money in the ledger," she said. "We'll stop," he said. "Thank you. You're welcome." They drank their coffee in a silence that was entirely different from any silence they had shared before. It had something in it now, a warmth, a recognition, the particular charged quality of two people who have admitted to something and are still in the room together, and finding that the room is fine. What happened over the next 2 months did not happen quickly. Henrietta Conley was not a woman who moved quickly toward anything that mattered, having learned at considerable personal cost that speed in important decisions is generally followed by regret. Aaron Graves was not a man who pushed. The combination of these two qualities resulted in a courtship, if you could call it that progressed with the deliberateness of something built to last. They had begun to have supper together. Not as employer and employee, but as themselves, after Lily was in bed, sitting at the kitchen table with whatever was left of the day's cooking and talking. They talked about the ranch and the cattle and the drought and the state of the range. They talked about books. They talked about Cassidy Creek, which was a small town with strong opinions about everything. They talked about the country, which in 1882 was a particular kind of chaotic and changing, and full of people trying to find their footing on shifting ground. She told him about Waco. Not all of it, not immediately, but piece by piece, the way you dismantle a wall carefully so nothing collapses on you. She told him about Daniel, and he listened without judgment, which was harder than it sounded because she knew she was telling him things that asked him to hold them carefully, and not everyone could do that. He told her about Clara Whitmore. He told it plainly, without self-pity, the way a man tells a story he has made his peace with mostly. He told her about the winter of 1879, and the cattle losses, and what it had done to the ranch and what it had done to him, and she listened the way he had listened to her, with full attention and no performance of it. One evening in late January, he had walked her out to see the new horses he had brought in from a breeder in San Marcos, 2 fine sorrels, and a mare with a particular quality of stillness that Henrietta admired immediately. They had stood at the paddock fence in the cold evening air with their breath making small clouds and the horses moving quietly in the near dark, and at some point she had become aware that their hands, both resting on the top rail of the fence, were very close together, and then his hand had moved and covered hers and she had let it. They had stood like that for a while without speaking. The horses moved. The cold pressed down from the dark sky. And something that had been careful and controlled and properly managed inside Henrietta Conley let go of a small piece of itself. "I think you're a good man," she said. "I'm trying to be," he said. "That's more than most," she said. In February, on a Sunday, he asked her to ride with him to the south pasture to look at a stretch of the creek that had been behaving oddly since the last rain. She had ridden before, though not recently, and he had saddled the sorrel mare for her without her asking, and held the horse while she mounted with the ease of someone who had learned young. They had ridden out in the late morning sunshine, Lily left in the capable hands of Cole's wife, who had developed an affection for the child that was entirely mutual, and the day had been one of those winter days in Texas that feels like an argument for the existence of a benevolent universe, warm and still, and full of a blue sky that went forever. The creek was fine, in the end. There had been some erosion near the south bend that he wanted to address before the spring rains, and he walked it with her, explaining his thinking about the repair. And she asked questions and made a suggestion about the angle of a small retaining bank that he considered and said was worth trying. They had eaten lunch sitting on the creek bank with the horses drinking downstream, sharing the bread and dried beef and apples that she had packed that morning. And the whole day had the quality of something simple and complete, and she had been aware, with a clarity she no longer tried to suppress, that she was happy. Aaron had looked at her in the midday light on the creek bank and said, "I'd like to ask you something, and I want you to know there's no pressure in the asking, and I'm completely prepared for any answer you give." "Ask it," she said. "I'd like to court you properly," he said, "if you're willing, at whatever pace you're comfortable with. I'd like you to know that my intentions are honorable and that I understand the situation is particular, given where we both started from." She had looked at him for a moment, this careful, honest, quietly generous man, and she had thought about dark secrets and hidden motives and betrayal and all the things she had been afraid of, and she had thought about the letter behind the clock and the boots outside her door and the ledger book and the fire split in the dark before dawn. "Yes," she said, "I'm willing." The courtship, conducted with propriety and care, lasted through the spring. He brought her flowers cut from the creek bank when they bloomed in March, the kind of small wildflowers that meant nothing to the world and everything to her, because he had thought to bring them. They rode together on Sunday afternoons when the weather allowed, and she discovered that Aaron Graves on horseback had a quality of ease and freedom that she had not seen in him in the house, as if the land itself relaxed him. She showed him, on one of those Sundays, a technique for apple butter that her mother had taught her, and he watched her work at the stove with an attention that was almost embarrassing in its completeness. Lily, who had been watching the developing situation with the unsentimental clarity of a 5-year-old, delivered her verdict in April when Aaron had lifted her up to see over the corral fence to watch a foal that had been born the previous day. "You smell like horses," she told him, critically. "I spend a lot of time with horses," he said. "Mama smells like bread," she said. "I like bread better." "So do I," he agreed. "But you're all right," Lily said, with magnanimous finality. And he had laughed, a genuine, unguarded laugh that Henrietta heard from the porch and stored in the collection of things about him that she was keeping. In May, walking back from a Sunday ride in the late light, he had stopped on the path between the paddock and the house and taken her face in both his hands, very gently, and kissed her. It was the first time he had kissed her, and it was careful and honest and warm, and she had kissed him back with a feeling that was somewhere between relief and arrival, like completing a journey she had been on for a long time. Summer came with its particular ferocity. The drought that had plagued the county for 2 years eased slightly in June, not enough to make anyone comfortable, but enough to give the pastures some color and to bring the creek up a few inches. And Aaron said it was the best June he'd had since 1879, and meant it as the high compliment it was. The ranch did well. 200 head of cattle went to market in July at prices that were fair, and Aaron came home from Abilene in a mood of quiet satisfaction that was about as close to celebratory as he got. And he brought Lily a stick of peppermint candy and Henrietta a small amber bottle of French perfume that she opened, and then stood holding for a full minute, because it was so extravagantly unnecessary and so precisely right. "Aaron," she said. "It was in the window of the dry goods store in Abilene," he said, with the studied casualness of a man who has rehearsed this. "Mrs. Kellerman had it in with the imported items." "It's too much," she said. "It's not," he said. "You can tell me it's too much, but it's not." She had looked at him with something she could feel changing in her chest, something that had been very carefully managed for a long time opening wider. She set the bottle down on the kitchen table and crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and put her arms around him and pressed her face against his chest, and he went very still for a moment as if he was not sure the moment was real, and then his arms came around her, and he held her with a care and a completeness that she had been hungrier for than she had known. She said, against his chest, "I think I'm in love with you." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said into her hair, "I know I'm in love with you. I've known it since November, since the morning you were at the stove at 4 in the morning with your hands shaking." She laughed, wet-eyed, which was something she hadn't done in a very long time. "That is not a romantic moment." "It is to me," he said. "It was the moment I knew you were the most—" He stopped, looking for the word. "The most real person I had ever watched in a room." She held on to him, and he held on to her. In the kitchen that had been hers for 10 months, with the stove warm and the evening coming down outside and Lily asleep upstairs, and all the careful distances between them finally and irrevocably closed. He asked her to marry him in August on a Saturday afternoon in the south pasture beside the creek, in the same spot where they had eaten lunch in February. He did not have a speech prepared, and he did not attempt one. He said, "I want to spend the rest of my life with you and Lily. I want to make this house what it was built to be. I want you to be here because you want to be here, not because you work here." He paused. "And I want to know what you think about that." She said yes without hesitation, which was not a thing she had expected of herself, but which turned out to be the simplest decision she had made in years. They were married in October, just over a year from the first day she had walked through his gate. The ceremony was held at the Baptist church in Cassidy Creek, the one with the flaking white paint, which had been freshly repainted for the occasion by 3 of Aaron's ranch hands who volunteered the labor on a Sunday morning without being asked. Reverend Marsh officiated with a warmth that suggested he had been waiting for Aaron Graves to do this for years. Cole and his wife were witnesses. Lily stood beside her mother in the dress Henrietta had made from the blue wool fabric, the fabric that had started everything, and held a bunch of the small creek wildflowers that Aaron had remembered to order from the florist in Abilene, and which had arrived the day before, slightly wilted but recoverable. Mrs. Dunbar, the dressmaker, was there, and old Sam Pickett from the feed store, who had set everything in motion with his description of a fair man. Most of Cassidy Creek was there, because Cassidy Creek was a small town and a wedding was always an occasion. Aaron Graves stood at the altar in his Sunday best, which was a dark broadcloth suit that he wore with the particular stiffness of a man unaccustomed to broadcloth. And when Henrietta walked down the aisle on the arm of old Sam Pickett, who had offered in lieu of any other option and been accepted with genuine gratitude, Aaron looked at her with an expression that Henrietta would carry with her for the rest of her life. Clear and unhidden and full of a love that had had a long time to settle and had settled deep. The exchange of vows was traditional and complete. He said his, she said hers. Lily, standing very straight, watched with the concentrated attention of someone for whom this was the most important event she had attended, which it was. Reverend Marsh said the words, and they were married, and Aaron kissed his wife in front of all of Cassidy Creek, and Lily tugged at his sleeve and said, "Does this mean you're my papa now?" With a directness that made half the church laugh, and Aaron leaned down and say, equally direct, "Yes, it does," with a steadiness that made the other half of the church cry. The reception was at the ranch, which Henrietta had prepared with the organizational thoroughness she applied to everything she considered important. The big dining room table that seated 10 had been extended with boards to seat 20, and it did seat 20, and there was roast beef and ham and 6 kinds of pie and cornbread and fresh cider, and a wedding cake that Mrs. Cole had made as her gift, 3 layers of vanilla cake with white sugar frosting, which Lily stood next to for the better part of an hour, convinced that if she remained close enough to it, it would not disappear. In the evening, when the guests had gone, and the house was quiet and Lily was asleep, having fought sleep with the desperation of a child who knows something important happened today and is afraid of missing the end of it, Aaron and Henrietta sat on the front porch in the October dark and listened to the ranch settling around them. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the particular quiet of 2 people who have arrived somewhere they intended to go. "I used to worry," she said, "that the house here was going to be like the arrangement, clean and clear and transactional. that I was going to spend the rest of my life being very organized about things and never letting myself need anything too much. Were you worried about that? He asked. I had good reasons to be, she said, but you made it difficult to maintain. Did I? He said with the closest thing to a satisfied tone she had ever heard from him. You know you did it on purpose. I did not, he said. I just wanted to do right by you. And you did it so quietly, she said, that I couldn't defend against it. I wasn't aware I was attacking anything, he said. You weren't. That's what made it so, she laughed softly. You undermined every reason I had for keeping a distance without ever giving me a reason to be afraid. He was quiet for a moment. I was afraid, he said. Of the whole thing, I was afraid you'd leave. I was afraid you'd find out about the ledger and be angry enough to leave. I was afraid I'd say something wrong and you'd decide I wasn't what you needed. You almost did, she said, when you said I know it and didn't apologize. Would you have preferred an apology? She considered this seriously. No, she said, an apology would have been wrong. You were right not to apologize. I wasn't sorry, he said simply. I still don't know that I was wrong exactly. You weren't exactly wrong, she said. You were complicated. She tilted her head to look at him. We were both complicated. We were, he agreed. She turned her face back to the dark yard, the horses quiet in the paddock, the stars doing their work overhead, and felt the warm weight of his arm around her and the solid reality of the house behind them, the house with its 4 bedrooms that had seemed forlorn and too large and was now simply a house with room to grow. Aaron, she said. I want to learn to run the books, she said. The ranch accounts. I want to understand the business. I don't want to just be here. I want to be part of what you're building. He was quiet for a moment and then said with absolute seriousness, I was hoping you'd say that. I noticed your accounts are a little disorganized, she said. They are, he agreed. Cole says so too. I have opinions about organization. I know you do, he said, and she could hear the smile in it. Is that acceptable? Henrietta, he said, in a tone that suggested the question was almost funny, you are the only person I have ever met who I would trust completely with everything I have built. Yes, it is acceptable. She felt something settle in her chest that was the last remaining piece of the careful, defended architecture she had built around herself, settling into its proper place and becoming something that was no longer defensive but foundational. Not a wall, a floor. Something you stand on, not something you hide behind. Winter came and went, and the second spring of the Graves' marriage was a busier one than the first. Henrietta had taken on the household accounts in November, and by March had reorganized them to a clarity that Aaron described as revelatory, and that the hands described, respectfully, as terrifying. She found 3 places where they had been overpaying for feed and renegotiated the contracts. She found a more efficient arrangement for the cattle drives that saved 2 days and a measurable amount of feed cost. She kept the kitchen running and kept Lily in school and kept the house honest, which was a different and more real kind of management than she had done when it was only work. Lily, who had started school in Cassidy Creek in January and who was 6 years old and developing opinions about everything, had adopted Aaron as her father with a thoroughness that left no room for qualification. She called him Papa. She brought her school reader home and made him hear her read aloud every evening, which he did with a patience and genuine interest that was not entirely performance. He taught her to sit a horse properly, and she came home from these lessons dusty and exhilarated and talking about horses with a technical specificity that suggested a future in the subject. In the late spring of 1883, Henrietta told Aaron that she was expecting. She told him on a Tuesday evening, straightforwardly, with no dramatics, in the kitchen after supper. She told him the way she told him most important things, directly and without performance, because that was who they were with each other. He sat very still for a moment. Then he looked at her with an expression that was so full of feeling she could not quite name all of it. There was joy in it, clear and immediate. There was something that was close to reverence. There was the particular expression of a man who has been given something he had stopped letting himself want. "Are you well?" was the first thing he said, which was the right first thing to say. "I am very well," she said. "Dr. Hale confirms it. He thinks December." Aaron stood up from the table and came around to where she was sitting and took her hands and held them and looked at her in a way that did not require any words, though he found some anyway. "I never thought," he stopped. "After Clara and after the way things were for so long, I stopped thinking about this, about any of this." He meant the house full of people, the family, the life the house had been built for. I stopped thinking I was going to have it." "You have it," she said. "We have it," he said with a precision that mattered. She squeezed his hands. "We have it," she agreed. Lily's response to the news, delivered at breakfast the next morning, was to ask several extremely practical questions about logistics, including where the baby would sleep and whether it would be quiet enough to allow proper rest for the horses. She was satisfied with the answers and declared the situation acceptable, which everyone agreed was the most important approval obtained. The summer of 1883 was the best year the Graves Ranch had seen in a decade. The drought had broken properly in the spring, real soaking rains that brought the grass back to the pastures, and the creek up to a proper level and the color back to the land. The cattle were in excellent condition. 2 of Aaron's horses won races at the county fair in August. The accounts were in order. The house was full of the sound of a family living in it. In Cassidy Creek, people talked about the Graves place the way people in small towns talk about things they are collectively proud of, as an example of what was possible in hard country if you were the right kind of people. Aaron Graves was regarded, as Sam Pickett had always said, as a fair man, and his wife was regarded as a woman of formidable competence and a surprising warmth once you got past the formidable part. Lily Graves, as she had begun to sign her school work, was regarded as a future force of nature. On the 15th of December, 1883, Henrietta gave birth to a son. He arrived at 4 in the morning, which she noted afterward was an hour she was already acquainted with and had made her peace with. And he was 8 pounds and healthy and angry about the world in the way that healthy newborns are angry, a complete and vigorous protest that is also the best possible sound. Aaron Graves held his son in the early morning light of the bedroom, in the house he had built 12 years ago for a family he had not yet found, and looked at the child and looked at his wife and found, for once, that he had no words at all. Which was all right, because some things do not need words. They named him Samuel for old Sam Pickett, who had set it all in motion with a description of a fair man, and who was so pleased by the honor that he closed the feed store for a whole day, which Cassidy Creek talked about for a month. Lily met her brother with a measured gravity befitting the gravity of the occasion. She examined him with the thoroughness of a 6-and-a-half-year-old accepting a new family member. She touched his hand with one finger and watched him grip it back. "He is very small," she said. "He'll grow," Aaron told her. "Horses are bigger when they're born," she said. "That's true," he said. "But he'll do," she decided, and kissed her mother's hand, and went to eat her breakfast. The years that followed built themselves one on another with the particular richness that comes when 2 people who have been through hard things find each other, and then find, every day, that they keep on being the right people for each other. They were not without difficulty, because nothing honest is without difficulty, and the ranch had its bad years and its good years, and the country was changing around them, the frontier pushing further, and the land itself being cut up and fenced and parceled in ways that changed the nature of the work. Aaron navigated it with the patient competence he brought to everything, and Henrietta navigated it with him, as his partner in the fullest sense of the word. She ran the books and she ran them well. When Aaron had the chance to buy an adjacent 300 acres in 1885 from a family that was moving to Colorado, it was Henrietta who had the accounts clear enough to show that they could do it, and they did. The Graves spread became a substantial holding that employed 6 ranch hands full-time and 2 seasonal workers, and was regarded as one of the better-run operations in the county. In 1885, a second son arrived, whom they named James for Aaron's father who had died the winter before Aaron staked his first claim. James was louder than Samuel had been and faster on his feet, walking at 10 months and running by 12, which kept everyone honest. Lily, who was now 8 years old and in full authority over both brothers, managed the household's small humans with a competence that was clearly inherited and an imperiousness that was very much her own. In 1887, on a warm September evening, Henrietta and Aaron sat on the front porch as they had sat on their wedding night 5 years before, and the yard before them contained their life in visible form. Samuel, nearly 4, was conducting a serious investigation of something in the dirt near the paddock fence. James, too, was asleep on a quilt in the last of the evening light, having decided suddenly and without consultation that he was done with the day. Lily, 10 years old and tall for her age, was in the paddock schooling a young horse under Cole's supervision, with a focused confidence that made Cole shake his head in admiring disbelief. The ranch stretched out in the golden September light, the pastures green from a summer that had been kind, the cattle visible in the distance in the south field, the creek a silver line at the edge of the property. The house behind them was warm with the smell of tonight's supper and the sounds of 3 children who lived in it without restraint. "I think about that April sometimes," Henrietta said. "Which April?" Aaron asked, though he knew. "When I walked through your gate with my carpet bag," she said. "I had $4.30 and Lily had a fever, and I had made up my mind that I was going to ask for work and not charity because I could not afford to need anything that I couldn't earn." "You were very clear about that," he said. "I was terrified," she said. "I know you were," he said. "You didn't show it." "I couldn't afford to show it," she said. She leaned her head against his shoulder as she had on their wedding night, as she had done 1,000 times since. "You gave me the work." "You did the work," he said. "That's different. And you gave me the other things," she said, without saying so. He was quiet for a moment. "I gave you what I could without making you feel the weight of it," he said. "That was all I knew how to do." "It was the right thing," she said. She thought about how to say what she meant, which was not a simple thing. It was about the particular way he had given without taking, helped without diminishing, cared without assuming. It was about the boots outside the door and the ledger book, and the way he had said "I know it" without apologizing. It was about every morning at the kitchen table, and every evening on the porch, and every argument they had had and resolved, and every decision made together over the accounts and the land and the children and the life. "It was the right thing," she said. "You knew what I needed, and you found a way to give it that left me my dignity. I didn't know at the time how rare that was." He put his arm around her. In the paddock, Lily brought the young horse to a smooth stop, and Cole said something that made her grin, wide and unguarded. Samuel found whatever he had been looking for in the dirt and held it up to the light with satisfaction. James slept on in the golden evening. "Henrietta," Aaron said. "Yes. I have something to tell you." She lifted her head and looked at him. There was something in his face that she recognized, the particular quality of a man about to say something he means completely. "I have been, every day since you walked through that gate, more grateful for your presence here than I have ever told you adequately," he said. "I am grateful for you running the books, and for the cornbread that is always right, and for the way you argue with me about the south pasture fence, which you are usually correct about. I am grateful for Lily, who is going to run something important someday, and for Samuel, who is exactly like you in ways that I find extraordinary, and for James, who is going to give us all gray hair and whom I love unreasonably." He paused. "I am grateful that you came to me asking for work instead of anything else, because it meant that everything you gave me after that, you gave me freely and not from gratitude or obligation or need. You chose this. You chose us, every day." She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had built a house too big for himself and kept it waiting, who had found a way to love her without ever making her feel the weight of being loved, who had given her work and given her more and said nothing and been patient and been true. "I chose you," she said, "every day, still." He kissed her there on the porch in the September evening, while the ranch settled around them, and the children were various distances from sleep, and the horses moved in the paddock, and the stars were beginning to appear above the plateau in their old and reliable way. Samuel wandered over from the paddock fence with his discovery, which turned out to be an interesting rock, and showed it to them both with great seriousness, and then sat down on the porch step and began explaining its qualities in detail. Lily came in from the paddock flushed with success, and talking about the horse at the speed that she reserved for subjects she considered important. James woke from his quilt and demanded immediate acknowledgement of his existence, which was provided. The porch and the yard and the house behind them were full in the way they were built to be full, and the evening came down over Cassidy Creek and the Graves Ranch, and all the difficult and beautiful and ordinary and irreplaceable things that had been built there. And it was good, and it was real, and it was theirs. It had begun with a woman who asked for work and not charity. It had continued with a man who found a way to give her both without saying so. And it had become, through two people's courage and honesty, and the particular kind of love that grows slowly in honest soil and lasts, because it was never hurried and never forced, something that would outlast the drought and the hard years and the changing country and the passage of time, the way things built from true materials always do. Samuel's interesting rock turned out to be, according to the assay office in Abilene, a piece of copper-bearing quartz, which was a minor sensation in Cassidy Creek for about 2 weeks, and which Samuel kept on his windowsill for the rest of his childhood as evidence that paying attention to things the world drops in your path is always worth the time. Aaron taught James to sit a horse properly in the spring of 1888, and James, who had been expected to be difficult about it, took to it with an ease that suggested the talent had been waiting for the opportunity. Lily, 13 years old and already the kind of person you wanted on your side in any difficult situation, had taken to helping Cole manage the younger horses in a capacity that was officially described as helping and unofficially described by Cole as essential. Henrietta, in the spring of 1888, was 31 years old and managing the accounts of a ranch that was producing well and growing, and she had a system for everything and an opinion about most things and a husband who valued both, and 3 children who were growing up knowing that the world was a place where honest work and honest love were the same kind of thing, 2 faces of the same coin. She was also, she told Aaron on a Tuesday evening after supper, expecting their 3rd child. He looked at her with the same expression he always had for this news, clear and full and glad, and said, "Are you well?" which was always the right first thing to say. "Perfectly well," she said. "Doctor." Hale says September. Their 3rd child, a daughter, arrived in September of 1888 as promised and was named Clara, not for Clara Whitmore, who was a closed chapter and a lesson learned and nothing more, but for Henrietta's own mother, who had taught her to make apple butter and to stand up straight and to ask for what she needed and not for more than she needed, which was advice that had in the end led her here. Lily, who was 12 and in full command of the situation, considered her new sister with appropriate thoroughness and declared her satisfactory, which was the highest rating she gave anything, and that settled it. The Graves family grew up in the house on the creek road 4 miles from Cassidy Creek, and the house was never quiet and always warm, and the accounts always balanced, and the cattle did well in the good years and survived the bad ones, and the children grew up knowing who they were and where they came from, which is everything a parent can give. And in the evenings, when the work was done and the children were in bed or occupied with the particular business of growing up, Aaron and Henrietta Graves sat on the front porch of the house he had built and she had filled, and they were together in the way that 2 people are together when they have built something real and know it. And the stars came out above the Edwards Plateau in their old and reliable way, and the creek ran below the south pasture, and the ranch lay quiet around them, and it was, by every measure that mattered, enough, more than enough, everything,